Thanks everybody for joining us on the opening of the fall series of Landscapes Live. Today we have the honor of hosting Nicole Gasparini. She is an associate professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Tulane University. Her research explores how landscapes evolve over different spatial and temporal scales. She's a co-developer of Child and LandLab, which are two widely used numerical tools for modeling surface processes. She and her team use field observations, numerical landscape simulation, remote sensing data, and other type of data collected by collaborators and government agencies to explore questions that intersect hydrology, tectonics, and sedimentology with geomorphology at the core. She obtained her bachelor's degree at the University of Buffalo, and she completed her master and doctorate degrees at MIT in the United States. We're happy to have her today, so Nicole, please take it away.
Thanks everyone for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit about some of the science that I've been working on with my collaborators. I also want to thank the organizers of Landscapes Live. I know that there's a lot of behind the scenes effort. These things take a lot of work, and I know the pay is usually pretty bad for these kinds of efforts. So I really appreciate it. I know many of you are early career scientists, and I feel like efforts like this are really important for making our community more accessible. So I love the science you're doing. I love what you're doing in our community and advocating for everyone. So keep it up. Thank you. We all benefit from that. The science that I'm going to present today was all done by Dr. Tingyan Lee and by Dr. Laurent Roberge, and just the messenger, and I had the privilege to work with them. Everything that I present is numerical. Well, all of the results are going to be from numerical modeling of landscapes. And so we use the LandLab toolkit, which is open source, and it's currently maintained by the CSDMS team. Both LandLab and CSDMS have received really generous funding from the U.S. National Science Foundation. And I've also received funding for the work that's presented here. So we're really grateful for the U.S. National Science Foundation, and we hope that they can continue funding wonderful science like this. Okay, so let's get into it. What do I mean by this goofy title, message in sediment in the bottle? So, oops. I am literally and figuratively referring to sediment in a bottle. So this is a photo from Frank Pizzalia, and there's close to 200 of these little square bottles here. They're each 1 centimeter cubed. And we collected those to get magnetic susceptibility data from each of those little, on each of those little bottles. So where did those bottles come from? In this case, we collected those sediments that are going to give us some kind of message from a sedimentary deposit. And so each of those little bottles is from one layer in the sedimentary deposit. So we can use that sediment to learn about conditions in the past. But we also use modern sediment for many things. In this picture, you can see there's like a little bag here, and we were collecting sediment to do cosmogenic radionuclide dating to get upstream average erosion rates. But we also do things like measuring grain size in modern rivers. And what do these measurements tell us? They basically tell us about the upstream. So the location where that sediment is produced via weathering and then sent downstream via surface processes, those messages are being sent downstream and encoded in some way in the sediment, and so into different sediment properties. So we're gonna today focus on that encoding in the sediment and what those messages can tell us. And the idea is motivated by the source to think framework, which I think many of you are familiar with. And the idea is with sediment being produced in the source and eventually ending up in the sink, and then we can interrogate that sediment in the sink, like in that sedimentary deposit that I showed you. So to learn about what the conditions were when that sediment was being transported and produced. And so what we're going to do today, though, is only focus on the source. So we're going to look at, through two different setups, the sediment that comes out of erosional systems and what that sediment can tell us or has the potential to tell us in different settings. Okay, so this is all going to be landscape evolution modeling. So I just want to get a few things straight before we start, or make sure we're all on the same page with some terminology. So everything that I show today is going to be steady state landscapes. So in the numerical landscape evolution modeling world, what that means is that the inputs are balanced by the outputs, and the inputs are rock uplifts. So you're putting material into the system through uplift, and then you're removing material through erosive processes, and that is the output. And when you reach steady state, those two things are balanced. So there's two types of steady states that we can get from the model. One is deterministic, and that literally means once you reach steady state, there is no change in the topography. So at every location in the landscape, whatever that rock uplift rate was, it is exactly matched by the erosion rate. So every time step, you have a little bit up and a little bit down, and you end up in the same exact place. So there's no change in time. And I'll illustrate some experiments like that. And I'll also illustrate some experiments that have a statistical steady state, or I'll use the term dynamic equilibrium. And that just means, in this particular case, that inputs, the rock uplift, is steady and uniform, so not changing in space or time. But the erosion processes are, sometimes you're eroding a little bit more than the rock uplift, and sometimes you're eroding a little bit less. But on average, everywhere in the landscape, you are eroding at the same rate as the rock uplift rate. Okay, so these are dynamic systems. And then we're going to talk about these signals, and there's going to be sort of like two focuses. The first part of the talk is going to really focus on external signals. Some people use the term allogenic, and oftentimes in the landscape evolution modeling world, we're thinking about things like climate or tectonics. I'm also going to use rock properties as an external process because it's not surface processes. And so this is a lovely image here on the right, and I think it's a great way to illustrate sort of an external forcing. So you can see in this image this fault right here. And so you can imagine maybe there was some slip on that fault scarp, and that may have sent a wave of erosion upstream into this erosional source. And then that wave of erosion maybe has sent a pulse of sediment downstream. So that would be an external force driving a sediment pulse. But also there are internal processes that can drive sediment signals. And so this is, again, a beautiful image here of a meandering river. And if you think about when a meandering river has a loop that cuts off, or a bend that cuts off, what happens as soon as that cutoff happens is the river slope increases because the length is shorter. And so because of that steepening in the river slope, you can get increased erosion, and you might get a pulse of erosion that is sent upstream, which sends a pulse of sediment downstream. So that is the internal surface processes doing their thing and creating a signal. And so both of those things need to be accounted for when we're thinking about what gets deposited in the sink. So this is really going to be a story in two parts. The first part was done, all the modeling was done by Dr. Tingyan Lee, who is currently a postdoc at Caltech, and he's soon to start a faculty position at Cornell. And in this part, we're going to think about a steady state that is deterministic. And what we're going to look at is the export of sediment from landscapes that have different climate forcing, tectonic forcing, and rock properties. And in this case, we're going to look how grain size variation is sensitive to those properties. In the second part, we're going to look at some results from Dr. Laurent Roberge, who this is from one part of his PhD. And it's not currently published, but you can access everything in the ESS Open Archive. So this is the work that he has done, and that is currently under review. Okay, so part one is looking at grain size signals. So if we go back to this river, you can see there's a distribution of grain sizes that's coming out of this watershed. And does that have any meaning at all? How can we read that? So in this part of the story, what we're going to look at is how can we, if we have sediment that's exported from an erosional system, does that grain size distribution at all reflect the forcing that created that landscape in the first place, okay? And so what we're going to look at is how climate, tectonics, and rock properties influence grain size variation. And in this case, all of the grain size variation comes from chemical weathering. And we're going to use the model Leonard Scolar and co-authors to model chemical weathering and grain size distributions. So I'm going to give you a quick primer on this model for chemical weathering. So if you look at this equation right here, and you just need to take away the essence of these equations. Really, the details don't matter, just the sensitivities matter. So there's this term D0, and that is the parent bedrock material grain size distribution. So if you think about bedrock, it's fractured and broken up. And before it gets chemically weathered, it's creating some grain size distribution that I'm going to call the parent grain size distribution. So this D0 is a grain size distribution, not just one grain size. And that's what comes from the bedrock before it gets chemically weathered. And then this W term is the weathering term that we're going to go through. And the larger W is, the more chemical weathering you have, the more reduced the grain sizes that come out of the chemical weathering engine will be. So what do I mean by that? I'm going to use the term chemical weathering engine a lot. And by that, I just mean you get parent, this D0 is the grain size distribution right coming out of the fractured bedrock. And as that sediment moves through the saprolite and soil to the surface, it is being chemically weathered. And based on what's going on in this chemical weathering engine, you can have a higher or lower W, and that higher or lower W will determine what the grain size distribution is at the surface, and then we export that sediment from the system. So all of the grain size reduction is happening here in the chemical weathering engine. So this W is a function of rock properties, climate, and tectonics. So first, rock properties control one, that initial grain size distribution. So this D0 term is controlled by rock properties. And so you can imagine how fractured the bedrock is to control what that initial grain size distribution is. And then we also have this term, FSM, which is the vulnerability of the rock to chemical weathering. So you can think of some rocks have minerals that are more vulnerable to chemical weathering. And the larger that is, the higher W is going to be. And bigger W means more reduction in grain size. Similarly, there's a climate term. And in this case, precipitation and temperature both increase this W term. You don't need to understand the details of this. You can just trust me. As P gets bigger, W gets bigger. And as T or temperature gets bigger, W gets bigger. And that's just because water is needed for chemical weathering, and temperature drives those reactions. And then finally, there's tectonics. And tectonics is like sort of masked in here through the erosion rate. And because we're thinking about steady state, the erosion rate is always going to be the same as the rock uplift rate. So basically, the erosion rate is the rock uplift rate. So the erosion rate is the tectonics term. And when you have a faster erosion rate, what it means is that material moves through that chemical weathering engine faster. So it has less time to be chemically weathered. So in this case, faster erosion, faster rock uplift means smaller W. Okay, so a lower erosion rate means more time in the engine and a larger W. Okay, so what we're going to do is step through some experiments where we change rock properties, climate, and tectonics, and we're going to apply that W equation on a landscape. So first, we also have to create a landscape based on climate and tectonics. And so we're going to use, in this case, this is a very common setup for this numerical model. We have rock uplift, fluvial incision, and hillslope processes. For fluvial incision, we're using the stream power model, and for hillslope processes, we're using linear diffusion. So this is sort of a very basic, simple model as far as the erosion processes go, but it's going to create landscapes, and then on those landscapes, we will calculate the weathering rate. And so because we are going to steady state, the change in elevation and time is going to be 0. So what that means is the rock uplift rate is perfectly matched by downcutting of rivers and removal of material from hill slopes. And there's no stochasticity in this model, so we're going to create deterministic steady state landscapes in which the topography is not changing through time. Okay, and then once we do that, we'll calculate the grain size distribution at every location on this landscape, and then we'll integrate that to get a grain size distribution of all that sediment mixed together, and that is the grain size distribution that is exported from the landscape. Okay, so the first scenario that I'm going to illustrate is the sensitivity of the weathering, or sorry, the sensitivity of exported grain size distribution to rock uplift, which again is erosion rate. And so not only do we have changes in rock uplift in these experiments, but in all of the experiments I present today, temperature is also going to decline with elevation. So there's a simple formula for lapse rate, which just relates as the higher you get in elevation, the lower the temperature gets. So you have these two factors, rock uplift rate and temperature, that are going to control the W term, okay? So as you increase rock uplift rate, you decrease the residence time, but as you have higher elevation, you decrease temperature too, okay? So these are the steady state landscapes that are produced in this scenario. So on the left is the lowest uplift rate scenario, and on the right is the highest uplift rate scenario. And you can, looking at this scale, you can see you have, in the high uplift rate scenario, you have the most relief in comparison with the low uplift rate scenario. So that landscape on the left, it's all blue because there's very little relief, because you don't have to erode that much because the rock uplift rate is low. And because of that, the topography is all close to 0 or sea level, the base level. And so that means the temperature is all a lot warmer on that landscape. And so what does that mean for W? So if you look at these plots from left to right, on the left, it's all red. And what that means, if you look at this scale, is that the whole landscape has a high W rate, which means a lot of weathering and just a lot of weathering, so you're going to really reduce the grain sizes. But if you move to the right, where you have a high uplift rate, you have two things happening. One is materials moving through that chemical weathering engine very fast. And then you also, at those high elevations, you have low temperature, and that also drives down W. And so, of course, that is going to be reflected in the grain size distribution that comes out. So remember, all of these have the same parent grain size distribution, but what's coming out is going to be much coarser in the high uplift case than it is in the low uplift case. And that, I think, intuitively makes sense for many of us. And so I'm going to show a bunch of plots that look like and these are PDFs of grain size distributions. So if you look at the top, it's a log scale of grain size. And then this is the distribution right here on the right. This black distribution is the unweathered parent material. And what you can see is all the way on the left, this light gray line is the lowest rock uplift rate. So in the case of the lowest rock uplift rate, the warmest landscape, you get the most reduction in grain size. And then when you have the highest rock uplift, you get the least reduction in grain size. Just for reference, these dots are D50, okay? So remember, this is integrating sediment from across the landscape. So it's what's exported from the landscape. In all of these plots, I'm going to show this green line, which is 2 millimeters. And of course, you probably know, right? 2 millimeters is the break between sand and gravel, okay? And so what you can see is that in that low uplift scenario, you have a lot of sand and finer material. But in those other scenarios, you have a lot of gravel moving through the system. Okay, so the second experiment is we're going to do everything we did in the first experiment, but we're also going to add orographic rainfall. So we're going to add a rainfall pattern, and that's driven by a physical model on top of these rock uplift scenarios. And we have three different, we're going to vary a parameter in the orographic rainfall. So we're going to have three rainfall scenarios, and we still have three uplift scenarios. So we have 9 modeled outputs in this time. So we still have residence time varying, which will control, and we'll have relief varying and temperature, but now we also have rainfall rate varying too. So we have all three of these parts of the weathering equation varying. And again, the D0 is the same in all of the setups. So in this case, because we have 9 different scenarios, we're going to simplify to graphs like this. And so these are swath profile data. So if you just look, for example, at this, 0 right here is the average at 0, the average value of the elevation. And so if you go into the range, like 200 is 20 kilometers. Sorry, this 200 is here 20 kilometers. It should be 20 kilometers. Sorry about that. That would be the average elevation in the middle of the topography. And then over here is the average elevation in the back. So you can just see basically into the range and out to the range. And this blue line is the lowest rock uplift rate. And you may not see it, but there's 3 lines there. And those are the 3 lines for the 3 different rainfall cases. So if we do the same thing in swath data over here, you can see what those different rainfall profiles look like. And the main difference is how much rainfall falls out in the front of the range. So do you lose a lot of rainfall in the front of the range, or does it get advected towards the back of the range? And so you can see there's these different rainfall patterns, but it really doesn't impact the elevation very much. And you get the same thing. So this is the medium rock uplift rate, and this is the high rock uplift rate. And you can see, despite having changes, so these gray lines are all the different rainfall scenarios for the high rock uplift rate, it doesn't change the topography too much. But we also know that rainfall plays a role in the weathering rate. So how much does this impact the weathering rate, or the weathering parameter? And what you can see, this is the weathering parameter, again, in swath data form. And you have the highest values in the low uplift rate scenario, just like we did before, and the lowest values in the low uplift rate scenario. But it's just really, most of the difference is right here at the front of the range. So what does that do to our PDFs of grain size? It doesn't do very much, okay? So again, here's our PDFs of grain size. This is the parent material, and that's the same for every scenario. And these gray ones are the highest uplift rate, and the blue ones are the lowest uplift rate. And then the variation in line is just different rainfall scenarios. And so what you can see, it might have a very small effect on D50, but in this modeling scenario with this rainfall scenario, you don't get much variation from rainfall that driving changes in grain size distribution. The last experiments I'm going to show are experiments that vary rock properties. So in this case, we're going to have spatially distribution. We're going to vary either the initial grain size distribution or this sensitivity to chemical weathering, but we're going to do one at a time. Rock uplift rate is going to be uniform, so only one rock uplift rate, and we're have uniform rainfall, but we still have temperature varying. So just rock properties and temperature varying in space. Or sorry, varying. Well, we have rock properties and temperature, yes, varying in space, and then also between the experiments. So we have 2 experiments here, one in which we have harder rock in the core of the range that will produce coarser grain sizes. And then on the flanks of the range, we are producing finer grain sizes because we have a finer D0. And then we have another scenario in which we just flip that, and we have the weaker rock in the core of the range. And also, so these are the 2 grain size distributions. Here's the coarser grain size distribution and the finer grain size distribution. And again, those are the parent material. And then we're also going to vary in the fluvial parameters, which I didn't talk about very much, but where you have harder rocks, it's going to be harder to erode them as well. So what that does is it creates really wacky looking steady state landscapes. So in the case where we have hard rock in the core of the range, what you can see is you get a higher relief in the core of the range, and generally a higher relief across the entire topography in comparison when you put the weaker rocks in the core of the range, okay? And when you have harder rocks on the flanks of the range, you get this kind of very weird looking landscape where you have these like peaks on the edges. So what does that do to the erodibility? It's actually really the main thing that's going to control what comes out of the weathering term is really the topography in this case. So it's the changes in topography that are going to be most important for varying W, because the changes in topography control temperature, and temperature is going to control weathering. So in the case, this case over here, where you have coarser material in the center, what you can see is because the topography is so low relief on the flanks, you have a much higher W, so you get more weathering on the flanks. Where you go really high, the temperature is decreased, and so you get this decline in W, and then again on the backside. In contrast, where you have that high erodibility on the outside, you have that high relief on the outside, you get lower W on the flanks, and that's because, again, as temperature decreases, as elevation decreases. So that's reflected in D50, and what turns out is that these scenarios don't create that different of exported grain size distribution. So again, if we sum the grain size distribution across all of the landscape, the blue is where you have finer material in the middle, and the orange is where you have coarser and harder material in the center. And the reason why the scenario with coarser material in the center is a little bit finer is because of this high W, or a lot of weathering on the flanks where you have that extra relief. Okay, so we can do a very similar experiment, but instead of varying the initial grain size, we can vary the sensitivity to chemical weathering. And so where we have harder rocks, it is less soluble, and so you have a smaller FSM, and where you have weaker rocks, you have a higher FSM. The topography that comes out is the same, because that's controlled by the erodibility, which is not varied between these. And it's essentially the same thing. Again, where you have less soluble material in the middle, what's really controlling is the topography. So in both of these runs, what we find is it's the topography that's really driving changes in chemical weathering that control what's exported from the system. Okay, so some takeaways from the work that Tingen did. Really, the biggest controls when you're looking at this chemical weathering function is residence time and temperature. And temperature is, of course, influenced by residence time, because residence time is influenced by rock uplift rate, which controls the topography and relief, which also controls temperature. So you get feedbacks in that way. And so thinking about that, you can think about, well, where you might get coarsest material is places where you have your rock moving through that weathering engine very quickly. A few things to think about is that the only control on grain size distribution decrease in this model is chemical weathering. And we also know that there are other factors, like rocks can break up as they're being carried in the fluvial system, and we don't have any abrasion or attrition in this model. And then also abrasion of the bed, we don't have any of that. So we don't have the grain size distribution playing into the surface processes. And so that could happen. That's why I was showing that line between sand and gravel. We know that how sand and gravel are transported in the fluvial system varies. And if we put that into the model, we might get other feedbacks coming out. Okay, the next thing that I'm going to talk about, so that was part one, take a breath. We're going to switch from grain size, and we're going to go to sediment flux signals. And in this case, we're going to look at sediment flux time series. And so this is the work that Laurent did. And I'm going to take his title and I'm going to change it to, can internal landslide noise disrupt external sedimentary signal transmission? So the idea is, because landslides are stochastic, they add variability to the sediment flux signal that is coming out of a landscape. But we also know that external processes like climate and tectonics are controlling ultimately what that sediment flux is. But there's internal variability that's kind of mixing up that signal. And we want to figure out how much mixing up happens in different scenarios and when we might be the most likely to preserve external signals that move through our erosional system, okay? And so this might feel a little bit esoteric, so I'm going to go through these amazing slides that Laurent made. So let's go back to our sedimentary deposit. This is in Utah, and Laurent is in there among other collaborators. And what they're doing is they're measuring suction, okay? So each one of these deposits represents a period in time. And in this case, on the right is older deposits, and on the left is younger deposits. So as we move through those deposits, we're actually moving through time, and hopefully we're recording something in that sediment that reflects what was happening at that time in the erosional system. And so as you move through those different layers, you can collect sediment regularly, and that's those little cubed boxes that I showed you. And so you collect all of that sediment, and you can put it together, and you can create a time series. So whatever variable you're looking at, grain size, magnetic susceptibility, erosion rate, whatever, maybe once you put it all together and do all your calculations, you will see a beautiful cyclicity in your variable. And I think when you see something like that, we are very tempted to go to something like this. Okay, so these are the Milankovitch cycles, which of course there's different cycles happening on different time periods. And it's very tempting if you see variability to point to one of these external forces, in this case of climate. But the thing is, remember there's internal processes that can mix up that signal. And so what we know is from past studies is that in order to get through those internal processes, and in this case, it's landslides, but it could also be meandering. It could be all kinds of things that add stochasticity to the system. We know that relatively long time scale signals, external signals, are more likely to get through, and relatively large variability is more likely to get through. So in this case, we are going to focus on time scales. So we are going to look at sediment flux time series and figure out what is the minimum periodicity of an external signal that can make it through the noise. Okay, so in this case, and hopefully this is transmitting well, you can see these GIFs on the right. These are landscapes that are in dynamic equilibrium. So what's going on here is that the rock uplift is steady, and on average, the sediment flux coming out of these watersheds is the same on average, but at any given moment, it's varying around the mean. And the difference between these two landscapes is the frequency of landsliding. So in the bottom landscape, if it's coming through for you, you can see it's kind of sparkling. That's because there's lots of small landslides in this experiment. On the top one, there's a lot less landslides, but when they happen, they're a lot bigger. And so these create different landscapes, and they also create different sediment time series that are sediment flux time series that are coming out of the watershed. So that's what we're going to look at, is these dynamic equilibrium sediment flux time series. And we're going to focus on how the fluvial parameters and the landslide frequency can influence that sediment flux time series, okay? The model we're using here is a little bit more complicated than the one that we used to evolve landscapes in the previous work that I showed you from Tingen. In this case, we're going to keep rock uplift steady and uniform in all experiments. And then we're going to model fluvial processes. In this case, it's a little bit more complicated in that we can account for fluvial incision and sediment transport and deposition in this fluvial process model, but it is still deterministic. So there's no stochasticity in the fluvial processes. And this is the space model that was presented by Charlie Shove and co-authors. And then for hill slope processes, we have these stochastic landslides, okay? And so if the hill slope gets too steep, there is some chance of it failing and creating a landslide, but it's probabilistic. So that adds in this variability, the stochasticity. And you can refer to Laurent's paper, but also we use the same exact setup that Benjamin Camfort's and co-authors did. So again, rock uplift is steady and uniform, but on average, the hill slope processes and fluvial processes are removing material, but they can also deposit material as well. So this is what these sediment flux time series look like. And so all of these are going to be shown as anomalies. So 0 would just mean that you have the same flux out as you have in, so that's steady state. But what you can see is we get a lot of variability. And this just looks like a jumbled mess. And so how are we supposed to analyze what external signals could come through this jumbled mess? And here we're going to use some magic that I don't fully understand. And I will refer you to the paper from Chloe Griffin and co-authors. And basically what they showed was that if you have a noisy sediment flux time series and you put it in power spectroscopy, so in this case, the periodicity, you can think of this as periodicity of the, of an external sediment, let me rephrase. We're taking this sediment flux time series and we're putting it in the power spectra. And so shorter periods mean things that are happening, repeating very quickly, and longer periods means things that are repeating less frequently or longer periodicity. And so what you can see from these time series, this is from Chloe's work, is that there's this area where power increases with periodicity, where it goes flat with periodicity, and where it declines. We're not going to think about this part at all. This part where power increases with periodicity is red noise. And here is white noise where it basically stays steady. What Chloe and others found is that there's this TRW, and that is basically where you measure that change in your system from red noise to white noise. That marks the time scale at which you can start preserving external signals. So remember, this is what's coming out. And the only signals that are likely to come out of this are ones that have a periodicity that is longer than this value. And I'm going to call that the preservation time scale. Okay. And so what we're going to do is measure the preservation time scale in 3 different scenarios and see how it varies. Okay, so this is varying the sediment settling velocity in the space model, which is not actually a measurable settling velocity. It's really a proxy for grain size. So the higher the settling velocity, the coarser the sediment. So this is fine sediment on the left and coarse sediment on the right. Here's the time series. The only difference between the middle row and the bottom row is the amount of time represented on the x-axis. So this is longer time period, and this is just zooming in into some time period in that time series. So it's a mess. Let's look at the power spectra, and it turns out they follow exactly as how Griffin and others predicted. At least we have this transition from red noise to white noise. And so again, where that transition happens, we have a time scale, and that is the minimum time scale at which periodicity of external signals can be recorded in this sediment flux time series. And so the finer the sediment is, the smaller that time scale is. So this means you have more likely to get preservation of external signals with finer sediment as in comparison with coarser sediment, okay? So we'll do the same thing with sediment erodibility, which again, is also related to grain size, but on the left you have harder to erode material, and on the right you have easier to erode material. And so when we look at the sediment flux time series coming out of each of these watersheds at dynamic equilibrium, it's a mess. But when we put it into the power spectra, what we can see is actually very similar to what we saw in the other case. In the previous case, we had the the shortest time scale for preservation where we had the smallest grains. And in this case, where it's the easiest to erode, we have the smallest time scale for preservation. The harder to erode it is, it means that longer signals are going to get eaten up in this internal system and they're not going to make it out. And the last thing we're going to vary is landslide return time. And so on the left, you have a lot of landslides, but they're small. So you have landslides happening a lot, but they're small, because remember, the average erosion rate is the same in all these experiments. In this case, you have a low landslide return time. So it means a large landslide return time, which means landslides are very infrequent, but when they happen, they're very big, okay? And so you get kind of a very odd time series of sediment flux in this particular case. And you can notice there's really a lot of variability. So in this zoom in, you actually have your sediment flux is higher than the average for this whole entire time period, but then will be longer periods where it's lower. And that's because there's really big perturbations in this system when you get a huge landslide. And that reflects in the time scale for preservation of external signals. So in this case, where you have these really large landslides, it turns out they just chew up a lot of external signals. And so in this case, you have the longest time scale for preservation. So this means any external signals that have a periodicity of less than 40,000 years are very unlikely to make it through this system. Whereas a lot of small landslides, you have a higher likelihood of preservation. So what does this mean? In our experiments, we showed some have a higher likelihood of shorter signals to get through. And we showed sort of a minimum preservation time of about 1,000 years. But on the flip side, we saw a lot longer preservation timescales where you have those really big hillside moving landslides. And that has a much longer preservation timescale. So any of these shorter Milankovitch scale sort of climate variability is not going to make it through in that case. But they may make it through in those cases where you have higher erodibility of your material. But in all cases, you don't have any really chance to get at variability like La Nina, El Nino, which has about a decadal time scale. Okay, so what can you do with these results? It seems like systems which move sediment through relatively quickly are more likely to preserve external signals with higher variability in time period. But don't forget, the only destruction of this external signal here is within the erosional system. So we're not thinking about the transport system, and we're not thinking about what might go on in the sink, okay? And that might make those timescales even longer. So what are some takeaways from this talk? I presented a lot of things. One takeaway that I want you to take is that the actual timescales that I said, or the actual grain size distributions that I showed, those are all functions of models that have a lot of parameters that are very hard to calibrate. And what that means is the exact grain sizes that come out, or the exact timescales that were produced in Laurent's modeling, those may not actually correlate to a particular location, but the trends are likely to hold. So for example, more easily erodible material seems like it has a shorter preservation timescale, which means like it's more likely to get external signals through. And similarly, the connection between topography and temperature, creating where you have high topography, low temperatures, coarser sediment, that's probably likely too. You just don't need to take away the exact D50s. Again, our results apply to like settings that have the same processes that are in these models. So if landslides aren't part of your system, you wouldn't want to use a model like this. But don't fear, you can create your own model and you can do similar things to what we did. And so if you want to have a different stochasticity that's driving variability in your sediment flux, you can do that. And I encourage you to do it with LandLab because it's open source and it's relatively easy. So go out there and let us know what you find. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Thank you so much for that talk. We have just opened the chat for questions. Elena, Sarah, and Luca Maltes and I will be reading your questions. So feel free to type them over there, and we're going to start asking the questions to Nicole. You're getting a lot of claps.
Sharing?
You can leave it, I think.
Leave it? Okay.
You can probably leave it. It might be useful for answering some of the questions.
Okay.
Maybe while people think about what to ask. First of all, thanks a lot, Nicole. That was great. I learned a lot. Maybe like following part 1. So like this study kind of showed the importance of weathering for grain size distribution, but like often when we look at sedimentary records, grain size distribution tell us something about how the the energy of the depositional settings. So then I wonder, like, should we then reconsider how we should we then rethink how we consider grain size analysis based on these, or like how do you connect the two things?
Okay, that's a great question. Thank you. And so what I would answer to that is, you said, well, the grain size distribution is more reflected by the conditions in the depositional system. And so I am not saying that that isn't true. This modeling only is referring to the sediment grain size distribution that is coming out of the erosional system. But how that sediment gets reworked and refined as it moves through the transport system and into the sink is not part of any of this modeling. So the sediment that's coming out, it's going to get reworked again. And if you're looking at sort of a sink that is very far from the source, you're going to have to add more filtering onto these results. So this might be more applicable to like a setting that's more like, say, an alluvial fan, where you have sediment coming right out and then getting deposited. And it's going to be more reflective of the conditions in the source. But you could take these sediment distribution and then put them into a depositional model, and they'll get more reworked. And then I think you would more address what you're talking about. Yeah. Great. Next project.
So while people keep pondering, we have, as I talk, Adam Forte starts the questions. I'll just carry on and read Adam's question for everyone. Great talk. For part 1, if the models had included a frost weathering cracking process, assuming it didn't, could you speculate how that might change the grain size distribution on the hill slopes that you see as rock uplift increases and temperature at the high elevation decreases and crosses into the zone where frost weathering becomes important?
Yes, I can speculate. So 1, you're correct. There is no frost weathering or any kind of physical weathering at all, except that initial grain size distribution, which is set. So there's no further process than that. I think what we have found in this model is that because the chemical weathering function developed by Scalarin team is so sensitive to temperature, and where temperature is low is where you would be most likely to get that frost cracking. And that's in places where we already are having very minimal chemical weathering anyway. And so what it could do is if in places where you have low temperatures, the chemical weathering might be low, but that frost cracking might be high. So that might be something that would reduce grain sizes. So at this point, we're getting the coarsest material from cool landscapes. But if you added something like that into the model, it would really reduce that feedback, because I think you would then get finer material, not necessarily finer than other settings, but it would reduce how coarse material, reduce the D50 of material coming out of cold environments.
Right, thank you, Adam. I hope it was speculating enough for you. Yes, thumbs up. Well, I'll just jump in with a question on my own before having another one from the chat. In part 2, you showed us this series of models with the landslides, the sort of scintillating GIFs, and on, I think it was the experiment 2, where you were testing the hardness of the lithology.
Yeah.
The question, yeah, so right, this was sediment. Okay, no, it was sediment erodibility. I was wondering if this factor impacts the landslides themselves. Does it mean that when it is harder to erode, the landslides get bigger and rarer, or if this is completely disconnected from the landslide machine here?
It's completely disconnected. Yes and no. So the sediment erodibility is not at all playing into what controls. It doesn't go into, let's say, the landslide model. So there's no parameter in the landslide model that is sediment erodibility. This is a model that is in this, or sorry, this is a parameter that is in the space model.
Okay, so that's in space. Yeah.
It's only in space. So it's only in the fluvial system. But it also, there's like other feedbacks, right? Because if you have easier to erode system, you get lower relief, and that, of course, can then impact whether or not you have landslides. So there are feedbacks like that within the model, even though the sediment erodibility only impacts how the fluvial system behaves, because how the fluvial system behaves impacts how the landsliding behaves. And so an interesting thing is, even though every single one of these landscapes have the same landslide return time, if you were to compare them to, if you were to look at like the number of landslides coming out, they might not be the same, simply because this one has the lowest relief. So it's not creating enough relief to actually drive landslides. So there's these feedbacks in there that actually play into each other, if that makes sense.
Right. So on the left-hand side in panel D, these bigger spikes, those are the larger landslides due to the steeper slopes.
Yes. Well, you also have to remember, if a large landslide happens, say, up here, that sediment gets reworked as it moves through the fluvial system. So if a large landslide occurs up here, you don't necessarily see it as a huge spike, because it may, that huge sediment can get diffused out.
Because it's harder to move out.
Yes,
right. Okay,
exactly.
okay. Yes.
Exactly.
Yes, indeed.
So there's multiple feedbacks happening in here. And so maybe this spike is a large landslide that happened to occur close to the watershed outlet.
That is close to the outlet. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Nicole, we have a comment and another question that was related to what you were just discussing. But Fausto said this, great talk, a lot to think. Thank you. Sorry, but I have to leave. And then Sam Kurama said, great talk. Thank you. How much does the magnitude of the landslide event factor in as well? For instance, will infrequent smaller landslides not shred as much signal?
Yes. Okay. So I think the way to answer this is maybe going here. And so when you have frequent small landslides, what happens is it's easier for the fluvial system to adjust to actually be transporting out those smaller bits of sediment. So you get less variability in the sediment flux. And so if you look at, and the scales are all the same here, and 0 is actually the same here because they all have the same rock uplift rate. And so what you can see is when you have very few landslides, but large landslides, it takes more time to really move that out of the system. And so that is what's reflected in that longer time scale for preservation, the longer minimum time scale for preservation. And so it seems like it's a lot easier for the fluvial system to handle a lot of landslides if they're small, in contrast to these like big, huge landslides. And so I think maybe taking that sort of to the real world, there's been a lot of studies that we know where there's like a huge earthquake and there's a lot of landslides that happen. And I think depending on whether huge landslides are happening or just small landslides, that might also play a role in that it's not just the amount of or the number of landslides, but like how much material is actually being eroded through those landslides.
Great. Okay, so thanks so much, Nicole. We're on the hour here. Just a reminder that we're going to post this talk on YouTube so you can share with anybody that missed it. Here is the link of our website. You can follow all the schedule that we had for this fall. We again want to thank Nicole for this great opening for the series. And we hope to see everybody next week. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye,
Thanks,
thank
Nicole.
you.